Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: A Garden of Screaming Roots. The first time Calvin heard the garden scream, he thought it was the wind. It had been a strange summer, the kind that made old people shake their heads and mutter about omens. The rain had come late, then all at once, flooding the small town of Darby Hollow for 3 straight days before vanishing like it had never happened. After that, the heat settled in thick and unrelenting, pressing against the town like a giant sweaty palm. And in the middle of it all, Calvin's mother had planted her damned garden. He hadn't wanted to move back to Darby Hollow. His mother, Irene, was getting old, and her memory had started slipping in ways he couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't just the misplaced keys or forgotten appointments. It was the way she sometimes looked at him like he was a stranger standing in her kitchen. So he came home. And the garden was already there. It had sprung up almost overnight in the backyard, a tangled mess of deep green vines, fat purple tomatoes, and dark red roses that smelled too sweet, almost rotten. He asked her where it had come from, and she just smiled, dirt under her fingernails, and said, "They wanted to grow. Calvin should have left it alone." But then the screaming started. It was a little past midnight when he heard it, sitting in the living room with a beer, flipping through an old photo album. A long, keening wail that rose from the backyard and curled through the open window like fingers reaching for him. He froze. The sound wasn't human. It was under the earth. And it was alive. Calvin sat frozen, the warm beer in his hand forgotten. The sound wasn't just a scream, it was many screams. Layered, twisting over each other like tangled roots. High-pitched wails, low guttural moans, sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. His stomach knotted. Maybe it was some kind of animal. A fox or a dying raccoon. Something that got tangled up in the mess of vines his mother had planted. But deep down, he knew better. The scream was coming from under the soil. Calvin stood, his pulse hammering in his throat. He walked to the window and peered out into the backyard. The garden was bathed in the pale glow of the moon, the leaves shifting slightly in the night breeze. It should have looked normal, but it didn't. The vines moved, not from the wind, but from something beneath them. He turned away from the window, rubbing a hand over his face. He was tired, that was all. His mother's condition, the stress of being back in this house, it was getting to him. He needed sleep. So he forced himself upstairs, shut his bedroom door, and told himself it was just his imagination. But when he closed his eyes, the screams followed him into his dreams. The next morning, the garden was bigger. Calvin stood on the porch, coffee in hand, staring at it. The vines had crept further across the yard, stretching toward the house like fingers desperate to grab hold. And the tomatoes, Jesus, the tomatoes. They were huge, swollen, their skins stretched so tight it looked like they might burst. Some of them had split open, revealing dark, wet insides that smelled wrong. The roses, too, had changed. Their petals were no longer red but deep, bruised purple, like a wound left too long to heal. His mother stood among them, humming to herself, gently touching the leaves as if they were children. "Mom," Calvin said cautiously, stepping off the porch. "What the hell is going on with this garden?" She turned to him, and for a moment he saw something in her expression that chilled him. The flicker of something not right. Then she smiled. They're just growing, honey. Like everything else. She knelt and ran her fingers through the dark soil. It's good dirt. Rich dirt. That's why they grow so fast. Calvin swallowed, his mouth dry. What kind of seeds did you plant? His mother's smile widened. Oh, I didn't plant them, dear. They planted themselves. His skin prickled. That night, the screaming came again. And this time, it didn't stop. The screaming started just after midnight, the same as before. But this time, it didn't fade, it grew. Calvin lay in bed, rigid, the sheets damp with sweat. The sound came from the backyard, swelling and twisting, rolling in waves like an ocean of agony beneath the soil. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the wind, but he could feel it now, vibrating through the floorboards, pulsing through the house like something alive. Then came the scratching, soft at first, a gentle scraping, like tree branches against the window. Then sharper, more deliberate. From underneath the bed, Calvin's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, a whisper. Help us. His body jolted. The voice was small, fragile, barely more than a breath. He forced himself to move, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The floor felt too soft beneath his feet, as if the wood itself had rotted overnight. He took slow, careful steps toward the window, keeping his breathing steady. The garden was moving. The vines curled and twisted like dying fingers. The roses trembled as if shivering in the summer heat. The swollen tomatoes, those dark, wrong-looking things, bulged, their skin stretching as if something inside was trying to push its way out. And then, his mother stepped into view. She stood barefoot among the plants, her nightgown swaying around her ankles. Her back was to him, but her hands were deep in the soil, clawing, digging. "Mom?" Calvin whispered. She didn't stop, didn't turn. She just kept digging. And then he saw them. The hands, reaching up from the dirt. A child's hands. Many children's hands. Calvin stumbled back from the window, bile rising in his throat. His mother was pulling them up, one by one, lifting them from the earth. But they weren't children. Not anymore. Their faces were slick with dirt, their eyes sunken pits of black. Their lips moved, but no sound came. The screams, the ones from the soil, were coming from them. Calvin turned and ran. Down the stairs, through the hallway toward the front door. He fumbled with the locks, hands shaking. Then, footsteps behind him. Slow, careful, not in a hurry. "Where are you going, dear?" His mother's voice. Too calm, too sweet. He turned and his stomach dropped. She stood there in her nightgown, her bare feet covered in mud. And she was smiling. "Come back to bed," she said softly. "It's just the garden. They get a little restless at night." Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs. "Mom, what did you do?" Her smile widened, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't her. Something ancient. Something hungry. "I fed them," she whispered. "And now, they need more." The front door slammed shut. Behind him, the vines began to creep inside. Calvin stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air in the house had changed. It felt thicker, pressing against his skin like wet hands. His mother stood in the dim light of the hallway, her bare feet sinking into the wooden floor as if the house itself were swallowing her. Behind her, the vines slithered in through the windows, curling around furniture, creeping toward him like hungry things. "Mom," he whispered, "we have to get out of here." She tilted her head, her eyes glassy and far away. "Why would I leave, dear? This is where I belong. Where we all belong." Calvin's stomach twisted. Behind her, the children were crawling in through the back door. Their little hands gripped the doorframe, their bodies pulling up from the earth like something half-born. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, veins twisting beneath the surface like roots in wet soil. Their eyes were still black pits, empty and watching. They weren't running. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Calvin turned and bolted up the stairs. His mother didn't try to stop him. She only laughed, a soft, rustling sound, like leaves scraping against stone. As he reached his bedroom, he shoved the door closed and locked it, pressing his back against the wood. His lungs burned, his hands shaking. From outside the window, the garden whispered, "Stay with us, Calvin." The voice wasn't his mother's. It wasn't the children's. It was something else. Something deeper. Older. His gaze snapped to the floor. The wood was moving. The lines in the grain shifted, twisting into shapes, faces, mouths opening in silent screams. A soft thump came from the closet. Calvin's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned his head. The door stood slightly ajar. The darkness inside was thicker than it should have been. Then, from within, something breathed. A slow, shuddering inhale. Calvin reached for the doorknob. His fingers trembled. He didn't want to open it, but he knew he had to. His hand closed around the knob. He pulled the door wide. And inside, the garden was waiting. Vines coiled up the walls, dripping with black, pulsing fruit that beat like hearts. The floor was soft, not wood anymore, but earth, damp and rich. And in the middle of it all a hole. A deep, black hole, stretching downward into nothingness. And then, hands shot up from the darkness. Calvin screamed. He staggered back as the hands clawed at the air, reaching, grasping. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, voices overlapping, pleading, crying, laughing. And then he saw it. The roots. They weren't just growing from the floor. They were growing from the bodies. Hundreds of them. Twisting through bone and flesh, replacing veins, pushing through skin. The children in the backyard weren't children anymore. They were part of the garden now. Calvin turned and ran, but the floor collapsed beneath him. He fell, plunging into the darkness. The last thing he heard was his mother's voice, whispering softly, lovingly, "Don't fight it, dear. Let the roots take hold." And then, the garden swallowed him whole. The next summer, the garden grew even bigger. The roses turned darker. The tomatoes swelled fat and red. And at night, when the wind was just right, you could still hear them. The roots, the voices, the garden screaming beneath the earth. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.